It was a cold Monday morning at Jefferson High, and the wind seemed to blow harder for the kids who didn't have brand new jackets. Among them was Marcus, a quiet boy who walked alone through the courtyard, gripping the straps of his backpack, wearing a coat that looked older than the school itself. The color had faded from army green to something between dust and memory, and its elbows were thinning from years of use. But the most noticeable thing was the patch sewn on the left sleeve. Square, hand stitched and slightly off. Color. It drew attention Marcus didn't want. To most students, it looked like a thrift store cast-off. To others, it was the perfect excuse to unleash cruelty. "Yo, Marcus, did your grandpa pull that out of a war museum?" Someone jeered from the bench by the flagpole. A few heads turned, followed by laughter. "You sure that thing's even clean?" Marcus didn't respond. He never did. He kept walking, eyes forward, posture straight, not because he didn't feel the shame, but because he wouldn't let them see it. The truth was that jacket had belonged to his grandfather, a veteran of a war that textbooks barely covered anymore. The patch, it wasn't a fashion choice. It had been sewn by his grandmother to cover the place where a bullet ripped through the sleeve and nearly ended a young soldier's life. But none of that mattered to the crowd gathering behind him. "Patch boy," someone called out, "nice elbow ventilators, dude." Another shoved his shoulder as he walked by, "You should retire that jacket before it retires itself." The hallway was no better. Whispers followed him from locker to classroom. Some students stared with curiosity, others with mockery. Marcus sat alone at lunch, same as always, picking at food he didn't have the appetite to eat. His jacket, once a treasured heirloom passed down with pride, had become a symbol of everything people thought was wrong with him. Quiet, poor, old-fashioned. But they didn't know that Marcus stayed after school every Wednesday to help veterans at the local shelter. They didn't know that he'd heard his grandfather's stories not from history books, but from the man himself. Stories of frostbitten nights, unspoken fear, and the brotherhood of soldiers. They didn't know that Marcus wore the jacket not because he had nothing else, but because it reminded him of someone who had given everything. Still, none of that stopped the daily teasing. Marcus's silence made him an easy target. He didn't lash out. He didn't explain. He endured. Each morning he slipped into the same jacket, not out of habit, but out of loyalty. Each stitch held a memory, and each sneer from classmates only made him hold his head a little higher. But no one saw it, not yet. To them, he was just the kid in the faded coat. Until the day the general arrived. The auditorium was packed, students filling every row, teachers lining the walls, and a quiet buzz in the air. It was Veterans Day, and Jefferson High had invited a decorated general to speak, an honor the school hadn't seen in years. The lights dimmed as the principal introduced the guest, his name followed by a long list of medals and accomplishments. When the general took the stage, his presence commanded the room without a single word. Tall, composed, his uniform crisp, his boots polished, he stepped to the podium and began to speak about service, sacrifice, and silent strength. Marcus sat 2 rows from the front, the same jacket wrapped tightly around him like a shield. He hadn't planned to attend, but his history teacher insisted. He slouched a little, hoping to go unnoticed. But as the general's eyes scanned the crowd mid-sentence, they landed on Marcus. And stayed there. The general paused. The silence was sharp, cutting through the room like a sudden gust. "You," he said, pointing directly. "Young man in the green jacket, please stand up." Gasps echoed. Every head turned toward Marcus. Some students snickered, expecting the same kind of ridicule they had been dishing out for weeks. Marcus hesitated, unsure, then slowly rose, heart pounding in his chest. The general stepped away from the podium and walked down the steps toward him, boots echoing in the silence. His eyes never left the jacket. "That patch," he said softly but clearly, "do you know what that is?" Marcus nodded, voice low. "It belonged to my grandfather. He served. My grandma stitched that after he was shot overseas." The general's face changed. Emotion flickered in his eyes. He placed a hand over the patch and nodded. "I know that unit. I fought alongside men who wore the same. That's not just a patch. That's history. That's sacrifice. That's honor." No one laughed now. The auditorium was frozen in reverent stillness. The general turned to the audience. "You see this jacket? It's not worn out. It's worn proud. Every faded thread, every stitch, tells a story most of us couldn't imagine. This young man wears it not because he has to, but because he understands what it means." A wave of realization swept through the room. Teachers looked stunned. Students stared in silence, their earlier mockery now echoing in their minds like shameful ghosts. The general reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver challenge coin, a token given in the military for exceptional character. He pressed it into Marcus's hand. "Thank you," he said, "for remembering, for honoring him, for teaching this room what real respect looks like." As the general returned to the stage, applause erupted. But this time, it wasn't for the speech, it was for Marcus. Classmates who once sneered now clapped with admiration. A few even stood. The boy they called Patch Boy had just reminded an entire school what real courage looked like. And in that moment, the jacket wasn't just honored. It was legendary.